Steve in Chicago. Hey, Steve, thanks for listening to WCPT. What's up?
Yes, I wanted to make the point that I certainly do agree with you. And as many people have noted, it's certainly the case that Americans should make note of their constitutional rights and their protections. And at the same time, recognizing that 2 o'clock in the morning on a dark street is not necessarily the place to argue the constitutionality of what an officer or officers may be doing to you. And that, it is in your best interest in many cases to defer to that authority. As much as it may be a misuse of authority and abuse of authority, that do not give them a reason.
Right, conform now and litigate later.
Exactly. And so, and I understand, the indignation that people feel. But
to the best of my knowledge, I mean, looking at this video with Sandra Bland, she did exactly what he told her to do. It took him 2 or 3 times, yelling at her to get out of the car before she got out of the car, but she did it.
Right, and that is the case. Now, what officers will argue, and again, this has to do with policing culture. I would admonish people to look at the scholarship behind police culture. And when you look at it, there's a great deal of it, and it suggests that police tend to have a worldview that is very different than what we would expect, those of us who are not police. And that's one in which, it's the police, we come first. We are a family. So the criminals are the enemy, and then the sort of average citizens, well, they're by and large kind of, pain in the ass.
They're the civilians. They're the ones who populate the set that we act on, basically.
Exactly. And to that extent, as a number of people have pointed out, there's a socioeconomic dimension to that. In other words, I live here in the most affluent community in downtown Chicago. And the kind of policing that I'm going to get, should I make a call or should I be stopped for a traffic violation, is very different given the way I look, the car that I drive, and so forth. That resonates with police. They know full well the kind of people that have the local television stations in their Rolodex.
Right. You don't pull over a white guy who's driving a $50,000 car.
Right, exactly. Well, and to the extent that you do, you're very cognizant of the fact that he's probably able to respond in a fashion to any misuse of power, abuse of power on your part, as opposed to someone else. And he has a degree of credibility that someone living in African-American, predominantly African-American housing project does not.
Right.
So, I think that, again, looking at policing, the way that police regard the rest of us, the way that they regard criminals. And again, it's this sort of notion that I have authority. It's inculcated in them from the beginning that you've got to demonstrate that you're in charge of the situation, and that should that escalate, then you've got to come back with a response that is even more aggressive. And again, if someone should respond, your response then needs to escalate. It's always the case that you need to be in charge, and that at no point can anyone demonstrate to you that your authority is in question, which is, I think, exactly what happens here.
Right.
So, I would argue that the young woman certainly was within her rights to challenge what the police officer was doing. But again, to all of us who would seek to engage in this sort of behavior, keep in mind what can happen. Because, you will get arrested at some point. And yes, down the road, you may sue, you may be successful in filing a lawsuit, a complaint, you may even get someone fired. But in the interim, you are going to spend the first several days in jail, possibly, while this is going on. And is that what you really want? So, I think that, we all need to be,
Steve, this sounds to me like victim blaming here.
Yes, and that's absolutely the case. I think that we should not.
So shouldn't we be talking about, instead of telling people, hey, defer to the cops, be deferential, particularly people who don't have money or resources to hold police accountable, shouldn't we, instead of telling them, hey, you should have been nice to that cop, you should have done exactly what he said, shouldn't we be saying it's time to change police culture? I mean, you've started this whole thing out by saying police culture is not what most people realize.
Exactly, and that's the point that a lot of activists.
So here's the question: how do we change police culture, Steve?
Oh, well, that's a question of public policy. You need to elect persons who are willing to change police departments at the from federal policing in terms of those agencies to state to local policing and municipalities. And until you elect the mayor, say, for instance, here in a city like Chicago, who's going to bring in a police chief who's going to change police culture, and policy and retraining and all of the things that come with it, you're not going to see change. But again, the old adage, you get the government that you deserve, until we begin to elect people who are going to address policing issues. Unfortunately, I would argue that we are a bit schizophrenic in this country with regard to policing because on the one hand, we are indignant about these kinds of situations. On the other hand, we have this perception in our minds that we do want police to be assertive and aggressive when it comes to a hypothetically
bad guys.
Hypothetical bad guy.
Yeah. No, I got it. Steve, thanks for the call. I think that the one of the most rapid ways that we could change police culture is to create oversight of police departments that is completely independent of the police or the prosecutor or the local judiciary, but that has actual power with regard to the police.